Oh, ladies and gentlemen, there is a hot debate raging in MMA. In fact, I would argue maybe the hottest. And it revolves around the 145-pound division. No, not heavyweight. No, not bantamweight. It is featherweight. And the question that is making everyone so crazy is, who is the best featherweight of all time? No, seriously, you don't have to take my word for it. Like, as a question of what the biggest debate is, Michael Chiesa actually thinks so too. And honestly, I think he's right. I think he's right on the money, as a matter of fact. Right now, there are very few things that rile up the fan base quite like this particular question. Hot debate, intense back and forth, and I'd say for good reason. We actually have three candidates, four depending on how froggy you want to get, who all have a pretty decent claim to the 145 best ever title. So for example, you could argue Holloway, Max Holloway, a former champ who defeated and stopped Jose Aldo twice, and Aldo being considered one of the consensus GOATs by many other folks. Like, he beat him twice. He also, in the case of Max Holloway, has absurd stats in terms of in a fight, over the course of his career, you name it. Of course, I just mentioned Aldo. You could make a case for him too. It's very easy, in fact. He's the standard bearer in the weight class, the first WEC and UFC featherweight champion with the longest title reign in division's history. It is also not really that hard to make a case for Alexander Volkanovski either. He's undefeated at featherweight, the current champion, and beat both Aldo and Max, and he beat Max 3 times. So how on earth are we going to be able to answer this question given these complexities and a seeming parity among the three? Well, like any debate, it comes down to the debate criteria. We need to identify the ways we measure fighting greatness first. People always try to have debates without agreeing to the terms of the debate and then act surprised when they go nowhere, by the way, just an aside. But okay, I am expecting dissent based on what I'm about to tell you. It doesn't matter what name I land on. There are different ways to measure fighting greatness. More on that in a moment, and I'm acknowledging that up front. But not every way is equally good, or in this particular case, not every way is equally relevant. The key is this: what criteria makes someone a weight class GOAT? What specifically are we identifying as meaningful criteria for why someone is the best 145-pound fighter ever? And in my mind, the answer is actually pretty simple. Number one, what did they do at featherweight? And number two, what did they do as a champion at featherweight? Right? Like, if you think about it, what else could it be? What that fighter did in another weight class for this particular conversation is literally not relevant. Now, I'm not necessarily saying someone who only fought in one division couldn't be the GOAT of the entire sport. That's not really my argument, but if they have losses in another division, that would be held against them for that debate. But it's not relevant for our purposes, so the point stands. Now, by this point in the conversation, you might think I'm about to litter you with esoteric stats or crazy arguments to overwhelm you, but I'm honestly not going to do that. Guys, I don't have to. This one is not difficult. The answer is Jose Aldo. That's it. It's Jose Aldo. It's not Max. It's Jose Aldo. It's not Alex. It's Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo is clearly the best featherweight of all time, at least until something changes, which it could, by the way, but we're not there yet. I mean, I'm not sure what to say. Just think about it for a second. I could show you a gazillion stats to prove my point, but what for? Guys, they all point in the same direction anyway. Aldo spent 2,544 days as champion in a Zuffa organization, which is the record. Volk, by the way, up to 290 will be about 1,300 days. Aldo has 9 consecutive title defenses, second only to Anderson Silva. If we're taking the case of Volkanovski again, he has less than half of that at 4, and 2 of them were against the same guy. Aldo was the youngest champion in Zuffa history at just 23 years old. Yes, Max made a young debut as well, but Volkanovski hadn't even made his MMA debut by that point. At 145, Aldo's finishing rate is 11 for 22 or 15% in title fights. He went 4 for 14 or 29%. Let's take the case of Volkanovski, since he's the current champion. His finishing rate at 145 is just 4 out of 12, or 33%. He's just 1 in 5 in championship fights, or 20%. Volkanovski went through 13 Zuffa fights before losing, again, albeit up a weight class, but it took Aldo 16 before he suffered one in a Zuffa organization. Aldo defended against Chad Mendes, Ricardo Lamas, Korean Zombie, Frankie Edgar, Kenny Florian, Mark Hominick, and Manny Gambarian, some of those names twice, but at least 7 contenders. For Volk, it's been just 3 names, albeit, yes, some good ones. In the case of Max, a great one. But you get the point. I can do this all day, but the math is simply not ambiguous. The fact remains no one has amassed a more accomplished record at 145 than Aldo. Now, I know there might be some temptations to dock him for perhaps a few different reasons. Let's go through them. Number one, he has had losses at 145. Volkanovski does not. Okay. You could also point out that he was never able to defeat anyone who first defeated him as well. Let's add that on there. Okay, fine. I get that. But given that his reign over the division is so much longer and the tenure of Volkanovski is so much shorter, it's not necessarily all that fair. Aldo's losses didn't show up until 7 years into his Zuffa experience, which is actually right where Volkanovski is at this moment. And by the way, up against a very difficult test in Yair Rodriguez at UFC 290. In my mind, a better test would be to see how he performs across the same expanse of time, although there's trouble with that too, since Aldo started much younger and, of course, in a bit of a different era. But what they did in the division and how many times they did it is basically the best criteria we have to answer this question. So I know there's going to be some who argue Holloway losing 3 times against Volkanovski is a better achievement than Aldo beating a Lamas or a Gamborian or whoever, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but again, there's problems with that argument as well. Number one, maintaining the belt over time is, I'd humbly submit, maybe the hardest thing to do in the entire UFC. You have to be consistently mistake-free or pretty damn close to it all the time. And not every time when Aldo went out there was he, for example, uninjured or had some other issue. He had a horrible weight cut against Mark Hominick, for example, still got the job done. So consistent excellence against the highest standard, in this particular case, title defenses, over time is what we're looking for. Second, if you look at the rankings of Aldo's title contending opponents, they were almost always ranked number 1 or 2. Seriously, just think about it for a second. Who can you really say that Aldo ducked who had earned a shot? Nobody. That he was leagues better than his competitors in many cases isn't exactly his fault. He's supposed to fight the best available in the weight class, and he did that over and over and over and over again. Not in 1934, but up until 2015, which is not that long ago. So who is the best featherweight of all time? Well, until someone can put together a better run than this, Jose Aldo. The debate, ladies and gentlemen, is over. Bye. There's more to the story, isn't there? Yes, there is. You see, asking a question about who has the best resume is not necessarily the same as asking who is the best fighter to ever compete at 145. That could be the same person, but it doesn't have to be. Just think about it this way for a second. You actually only need to have fought in the weight class once to even qualify for the latter designation. How about this? Imagine it this way. We'd have to put some parameters around what it means to have fought in the weight class. Are we saying UFC only, pro only, how many times, blah, 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 but we can come to a resolution. And in this case, we're not asking whose resume in just one weight class is the strongest for that weight class. We're asking whose overall resume is the strongest amongst those who have ever competed in that weight class. Not the same thing, at least not necessarily the same thing. Aldo has a more distinguished featherweight resume, yes, even despite the losses. But he is not a better fighter than Volkanovski. Y'all, you already know this to be true. For crying out loud, we know that because he already beat Aldo. Cleanly. It's not even a very difficult fight to score, ladies and gentlemen. I don't even think Volk lost a single round. And by the way, that fight was in Brazil. Also, not only has Volk beaten Aldo, he's beaten the guy that beat and stopped Aldo twice and wore a belt in this weight class, and he did it 3 times. He's also undefeated at 145, while Aldo is not. Volkanovski only lost when he went up a weight class, and even then there's controversy about it. And Volkanovski doesn't have as many title defenses, okay, but look at what he does in those title fights, and in particular in the championship rounds. This data comes to us, by the way, courtesy of FightMetric, aka 3027. Shouts to those boys. Volk has had 10 championship rounds in the UFC. He's won 5 of them unanimously. In 3 of them, he's gone 2-1. He's only unanimously lost 1 championship round, one more time, in the fight that was up a weight class. And there's more. Think about the striking stats in those rounds, right? In round 4, he averages 6.37 strikes per minute, the 9th highest in UFC history. In round 5, he averages 7.52. That is the 5th highest rate in UFC history. My man is literally setting records or coming close to it in those spots. Compare that to Aldo. He dropped championship rounds to Hominick. Edgar, Lamas, and Mendez. Even ignoring parts of his decline and just looking at the striking stats from 2011 to 2017, his round 4 average is 2.56 and round 5 is 2.73. Nothing special by any stretch of the imagination. Or how about absolute status? Many consider Volkanovski to be the best pound-for-pound fighter in the sport, and even if you don't rank him that way, he has officially held that spot through the UFC's own ranking system. Aldo competed alongside the GSPs and the Joneses and the Silvas of the world. Okay, fair enough, but he never once held that designation. So yes, Volkanovski is a better fighter than Aldo. He's better than Holloway. I'm arguing, in fact, and explicitly, he's the best fighter to ever compete at 145. All right, so let's bring it all home, shall we? Let's put it all together. Remember when I said there are different ways to measure greatness? This is exactly that. It's the best featherweight ever, in the case of Jose Aldo, versus the best fighter to compete at featherweight in Volkanovski. Volkanovski simply hasn't done enough in a featherweight campaign to claim he's the greatest 145er, but he's also clearly the most updated, modern version of a featherweight we've ever seen, and his record of excellence against the other top 145ers speaks to that. And actually, when you think about it, Aldo and Volk have one thing maybe in common. They're both actually innovators. More so maybe Aldo than Volk, but it's true in both cases for different reasons. Aldo changed the game in terms of strikers with elite takedown defense, leg kicking potential, and just so much more, especially for the little weight guys. And Volkanovski has changed the game by the ability to scramble his opponent's brains, as he calls it. He's like a master feinter, a rhythm setter, and disruptor, and so much more. But the reality is that Volkanovski is the innovator of that which came from and after Aldo's era of dominance. Someone else will eventually be the next great champion at 145 and innovate past the stage of MMA. But right now, he's the leading edge. He is the most current version of excellence, and also to date, it's apex. So yeah, Jose Aldo has had the most successful run at 145 in MMA history. At that weight class, he's put together the most accomplished work overall. But who is the best MMA fighter to ever compete at featherweight? It's Alexander Volkanovski, and it's not particularly close. They're both great. But as I mentioned before, greatness takes many forms.